having those conversations within the school community and shifting the emphasis towards bursaries as being your main focus for fundraising. Was there pushback? Were you kind of pushing an open door? Was there a sense that you were leading a very willing community, or was there quite a lot of work to be done to explain the root of your passion in this area, why this was a good direction to be taken?
No, I mean, I can understand why, it might sound to people very daunting, but actually, I mean, everyone's got to start somewhere.
Yeah.
And if you look at schools like Manchester Grammar, Bolton, King Edward's, Birmingham, they've all done great things with bursaries, and you've got to start somewhere. And we started very small, and when our development office, began in 2004, I think, in their first year of fundraising, they probably raised, I think they were very sort of pleased to have raised about £20,000.
Yeah.
So, you've got to start somewhere, and the sooner you start, however small, the better, because then you can sort of build on that.
Welcome to the Independent School Podcast. Thinking and acting strategically is the key to both securing the future of your school and helping to build a more equal and just world. My name's Juliette Corbett. I'm a consultant, speaker and facilitator specialising in helping independent schools. In this podcast, I translate tried and tested strategy and fundraising techniques into a language that works for schools. So if you're a senior leader in a private school and you want your daily work to feel less exhausting and more strategic, and if you want once more to feel the joy of making the world a better place through education, then you're in the right place. Welcome, and let's get started on this week's episode. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode, where I am really delighted that we are going to be talking to David Goodhew, head of Latymer Upper School. Any of you who have been in the independent school sector, in the UK at least, for a few years will know that David has been a huge advocate for education as a force for good through social mobility in particular. So I'm really excited to be sharing this conversation that I had with him, where we talk about all things bursary campaign and social mobility. So David Goodhew's been head of Latymer Upper School since 2012 and is a member of the Headmasters and Headmistresses Conference. He was born in West London and he attended a local comprehensive school and was the first member of his family to do A-levels and then to go on to university. He graduated from Oxford with a first in classics. David is committed to advancing social mobility through his school's bursary programme, in conjunction with its partnership work and its outreach as well. In 2017, he launched the Inspiring Minds campaign with the aim of raising £40 million so that the school could offer 1 in 4 pupils a means-tested bursary by 2024, which was actually Latymer Foundation's 400th anniversary. And they are doing amazingly well. They are almost at that target with 3 years still to go. And for those of you inside the UK, you will know how substantial that achievement is in the UK school sector. And if you're joining us from overseas, this is by far and away one of the biggest fundraising totals that we've seen within a UK school fundraising for bursaries. I'm going to actually put the link to their fantastic Inspiring Minds video in the episode notes, and I tell you, the children tell the story of the campaign, and I challenge you to watch it without smiling. It is impossible. In January 2021, the school also launched its Attain programme, offering catch-up support for Year 5 and 6 pupils in 12 partner state primary schools and also in a secondary school as well. And that work has continued through into this academic year too. In 2018, Latymer won 3 TES awards, including Independent School of the Year, and David was also finalist in the Social Mobility Champion category of the UK Social Mobility Awards. In keeping with Latymer's belief that work isn't everything, we need to be well-rounded individuals, David is also a keen amateur violinist, and his hobbies include cycling and classical music. I was really thrilled when David agreed to be on the podcast because I know you're going to love listening to his views around social mobility and bursaries. Really quickly, before we dive into the detail, I want to make sure that you make the most of the time you invest listening to this podcast. And the best way to do that is to make sure you grab a copy of my free ebook, The Strategic Independent School Leader. It outlines how to answer the 6 essential questions that will clarify your school strategy and secure its future. In the world of business, strategy can be full of jargon, but it doesn't have to be that way. This is a jargon-free tool tailor-made to help private school leaders think and act more strategically. Download your free copy today at www.consultjuliet.co.uk/ebook. And so, with no further ado, let's listen to my conversation with David Goodhew. Hello, David, and welcome to the Independent School Podcast. It's fantastic to have you here with us today.
Well, thanks for having me.
So, one of the questions I love to ask, especially when we have heads on the podcast, is about the root of your passion for education. Obviously, you have chosen to forge a career in the education sector. What's your kind of reason for doing that? What's the root of this passion for the power of education, do you think?
So I think it's really the thought that a good education can and should change your life. And, I know that's certainly true for me. I was the first member of my family to do A levels or go to university. And that was because I had, the benefit of wonderful teachers who inspired me with a love of their subject. And, that's something I'll be eternally grateful for. And I'm really keen to make sure, I mean, certainly in my time as a teacher, I was very keen to try and sort of do that for other people. And now, as a head, I'm keen to make sure that all of my teachers do that for as many pupils as possible, whether or not they can go to Latymer.
Yeah, it's a bit of a cliche, but it is transformational, isn't it, education? I think that's why it's so important that we have wider access to really superb, excellent education in this country.
No, I think that's absolutely right, and that's why we're so passionate about bursaries.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit more. I'd love to hear more about your Inspiring Minds campaign, and it's a pretty ambitious target that you've got there, 40 million. How's things going?
Really well. So, I mean, we began in 2014, and in 2014, the number of pupils on a bursary at Latimer was around 1 in 10, and we set ourselves the goal of raising £40 million by 2024, which is the 400th anniversary of the Latimer Foundation, and we wanted to be in a position to support 1 in 4 students in the school on the bursary. And the brilliant news is that we're a few years away from that deadline, and to date, we've raised about £36.5 million. And the
Fantastic.
impact of that's been extraordinary because we've gone from a situation where we've had 1 in 10 on bursaries to today we've got 1 in 5. And so we're really set fair to hit our goal of 1 in 4 by 2024.
It's fantastic, and it's a real example to other schools that are trying to achieve something similar. And I wonder what encouraged you initially to make bursaries your fundraising focus. Because if I remember rightly, when you arrived at the school, it wasn't that way, was it? It wasn't all about bursary fundraising.
No, that's right. And I suppose there were a number of things, really. I mean, I think it was a coincidence, a confluence of 3 factors. So obviously, there was a national need, and we were, acutely aware of the data even back then about the disadvantaged gap. And the Sutton Trust had done some excellent, if depressing, work on the the gap between the brightest 15-year-olds from poor backgrounds and the brightest 15-year-olds from wealthy backgrounds. And of course, sadly, as a result of COVID, that gap has widened rather
Mm.
than closing. And we know from the OECD that if you take students from disadvantaged backgrounds and put them in advantaged schools, the effect size is 2.5 years. So you can reverse the attainment gap with bursaries. So that there was a sort of national need. There was a school need. I mean, the school, like so many independent schools, used to be a direct grant grammar school before 1976, and that meant that 80% of the students who were here on free places. And that kind of grammar school ethos is really sort of fundamental to what makes Latimer feel different. And so we felt, particularly with a view to our 400th anniversary, that it was really appropriate for the school to sort of be moving back in the direction of its sort of best and truest self. And then, as I've mentioned, there were very personal reasons for me. I grew up down the road from Latimer, and certainly couldn't have afforded to come here in the 80s. And so, I really want to make sure that we are opening up access to the school as much as we can to local children. And then for those who can't come here on bursaries, we complement that with our outreach and partnership activity, because bursaries plus partnerships and outreach is complementary. It's all part of our social impact, and they work very closely together.
Mm, absolutely. So one of the things that I'm aware of is that others who are listening to this podcast might be feeling that actually you've done so incredibly well. It's almost impossible to follow in your footsteps. But back in those early days, as you were having those conversations within the school community and shifting the emphasis towards bursaries as being your main focus for fundraising, was there pushback? Were you kind of pushing an open door? Was there a sense that you were leading a very willing community, or was there quite a lot of work to be done to explain the root of your passion in this area, why this was a good direction to be taken?
No, I mean, I can understand why it might sound to people very daunting, but actually, I mean, everyone's got to start somewhere. And
Yeah.
if you look at schools like Manchester Grammar, Bolton, King Edward's, Birmingham, they've all done great things with bursaries, and you've got to start somewhere. And we started very small, and when our development office began in 2004, I think in their first year of fundraising, they probably raised, I think they were very sort of pleased to have raised about £20,000.
Yeah.
So, you've got to start somewhere, and the sooner you start, however small, the better, because then you can sort of build on that. But in terms of the conversations we were having, what was interesting was we were very much pushing at an open door, and for pupils and alumni and parents and teachers, this felt like the right thing to be doing. And it's interesting why. I mean, there are pupils here who know their best friend wouldn't be in the school if it wasn't for a bursary. So the pupils
Mhm.
themselves have a fundraising club called Raise, which supports bursaries. For parents, they want their children to come to a school that is a school for people from all walks of life, because that kind of diversity is really key. Increasingly we see the disadvantages of sort of growing up in a monoculture or a privileged bubble, and so actually our fee paying parents want the diversity that the bursary program brings. So for parents, it was a very easy sell. For
Mhm.
staff, really interestingly, we have found that it is a recruiter and a retainer of the best teachers, because people who go into teaching frequently have a very strong social conscience. And working in the independent sector isn't always something that sits naturally with them. I mean, I only ended up in independent schools myself by accident, because my subject, which is classics, there weren't really any jobs available when I graduated. So I ended up in the independent sector by accident. It wasn't my natural home, and there are lots of colleagues for whom the fact that we're an independent school that is doing such good work, both in terms of bursaries and outreach and partnerships, is a really important piece for them, and it's bringing them to our door and also encouraging them to stay. So staff, parents, pupils, and then alumni. Well, of course, the alumni who were here before 1976 remember us as a direct grant grammar school and are really over the moon that we're sort of heading back in that direction. And more recent alumni, particularly those who've sort of come through the bursary program, are very keen to sort of give back and give someone else that opportunity. And I meet annually with all of our bursary holders, and they always tell me at the end, if I can later in life, I want to give someone else this chance. So actually, from every kind of section of the community, there was overwhelming support that this was the right thing to do. And I think the reason it's been so successful is it's authentic. It's something we're really sincere about, and it really matters to us. So it's not something that's sort of window dressing or ticking a box or jumping on a trend. It's something that we've thought very deeply about and really reflects some sincerely held beliefs and values that we have about ourselves as a school.
Yeah, I am absolutely thrilled to hear you say some of those things, because these are exactly the sorts of things that I'm putting up on whiteboards and flip charts when I'm doing workshops with schools who are just starting on this journey or wanting to expand their bursary program, and talking about the fact this isn't just about social mobility and social justice and opportunities for individual children, although that is critically important. It's also about actually this benefits the whole school community. That there is
Mm.
a sense increasingly that parents understand that diverse classrooms are better classrooms. They are classrooms in which real education that prepares individuals for genuinely for life. That diversity
Well,
is
that's
critically important.
I couldn't agree more because I mean, let's be honest. One of the things we've learned from the pandemic is you can do something that looks like remote teaching and learning pretty effectively, via Zoom or Google Meet or Teams or whatever, and you can deliver content reasonably well. But I would argue what it's also taught us is that actually that isn't an education. And for me, education is a social experience. And if education is a social experience about growing up and learning life lessons in the company of others, and particularly learning from your mistakes, then if it's a social experience and if it's about more than delivering the content of teaching and learning, then who you are at school with is a vital part of your education. And many of us sort of reflect that when we went to university, we learned as much from the people we were there with as we did from our tutors. But I'd say that's true at secondary level as well. And of course, we know from work on the neuroscience of the teen brain that actually teenagers are hardwired to pay attention to their peers throughout that period. A really crucial period in their development. So, at a time when you are, deciding the person you're going to become, and education as a social experience, then you need, a diverse group of peers to make sure that you're sort of getting, the best educational experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm seeing increasingly that the really good case for supports for bursary programs across the country are now starting to really expand on this message. And that, as you said, for parents, this is a critical area for them to understand that. And I think it also enhances this sense of partnership rather than charity. And this is a sense of a mutually beneficial relationship that you're forming with the families who are coming to the school. And I think the other thing you mentioned there around staff recruitment is also really important. I mean, like you, independent schooling isn't naturally my home. And so
Mm.
for me, it's a sense that I'm in this sector because I can see the good work that's being done and I want to enhance and contribute to that. And I think it's absolutely true that for the majority of teachers, it is a real extra motivator to know that their school is doing something like this. So I think absolutely, and once you get the momentum built, all these things feed into each other, don't they? Because you're kind of attracting potential parents who like this idea of a more diverse school community. You're then more inherently going to be encouraging them to be giving, and your pupils are starting to get involved as well in the fundraising. So it becomes a really momentum building virtuous cycle once you get going, and your culture shifts
I think
imperceptibly
that's
each year in that direction.
No, I think you're absolutely right. But coming back to what you were saying earlier, that's why everyone has to start somewhere.
Yeah.
And if you look at the schools that are really successful at doing this, by and large, it's not least because they've been doing it for a very long time.
Yes.
So I think start small, start somewhere, but start.
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. So obviously the last few years have thrown a few kind of curveballs at us around COVID, around the impact it's had on the way that we fundraise and so on. Have you had to make big changes to the way that you're fundraising for the bursaries program through the pandemic?
Um, well, I mean, again, a lot of the sort of events that we typically would have run moved online.
Mhm.
Interestingly, very successfully. And we had, for example, in terms of alumni engagement, a lot of our US alumni, who obviously, for obvious reasons, can't normally come to the events that we host in school, were suddenly able to participate. So that some of those are going to be sort of COVID keepers because those events went really well and people really appreciated them. I think, I mean, the fundraising went particularly well. It was also helpful that part of our Inspiring Minds campaign aimed at increasing our endowment because, unlike some schools, we don't have an enormous founding endowment. We don't have, city guilds or livery companies who can fund match what we do. So we've kind of had to do it ourselves. But one of the things we were very clear on, and that's why it's a 10-year campaign, was the need to build up endowment to secure the bursary provision in perpetuity. And the reason that's relevant is, the risk during the pandemic, if you think about the financial pressure that all independent schools came under, for example, in terms of discounting fees, at a different time, that kind of financial crisis would have, meant that we would have had to reduce the number of bursaries we offered. But because of the growth in the endowment, and also because of the continued fundraising success, we were actually able to increase the number of bursaries we offered, both in terms of the sort of usual admissions bursaries that we would do, but in particular, the award of sort of, for want of a better word, hard times bursaries for families who, for understandable reasons, were in financial difficulties because of the pandemic. And we really wanted to make sure that we didn't lose anyone
Mm.
for financial reasons. So actually, we were able to increase our bursary provision throughout the pandemic. And that's, that's a really good thing.
Yeah.
And then I suppose the other kind of strands to that was, understanding, that a lot of our kind of community work, which, as I said, is complementary to our bursary provision, was really key. I mean, so, a really simple example, we knew that our bursary students were going to need help with access to digital devices, and in particular dongles, to be able to access remote teaching and learning at home. But what we quickly realized is it wasn't just our bursary students who needed that, and actually we were providing hundreds of dongles and laptops to children in the local community, whether or not they were our bursary students, because unfortunately, although the Department for Education announced in April that it was going to do this, it didn't actually deliver anything until mid-July, i.e., in time for the summer holiday. So the
Mm.
irony is that as an independent school, I think I'm right in saying that at the time they were needed, which was April, we provided more laptops and dongles to local kids than the Department for Education did.
And that's just a superb example of some of the agility that we can see within the sector as well. And I know that your outreach and partnerships work is also kind of adapted over time with your new Aspire program, focusing on catch up. Is
Yeah,
that a new program or an adapted program, I think, in response to the pandemic? Is that right?
yeah, so attain, yeah. So I
Sorry,
mean,
attain.
yeah, attain, yeah. So absolutely, and again, I mean, we put that in place when it was clear. I mean, again, the government announced a big summer of catch up, and that never happened. And indeed, the national tutoring program, isn't going well either. But we were able, because we've got such an extensive partnership network with local primary and secondary schools. We partner with over 50 local schools, working with about 1,000 children in a typical year. So we used our own network and said, okay, what do you need in terms of, for want of a better word, catch up? And primary schools said, right, we would really like some help with, literacy and numeracy. Secondary schools said science. And so, we again, one of the great things that we learned from the pandemic was, Google and Zoom meant we could deliver these things really efficiently, because in the past, what's always got in the way of schools being able to collaborate, for example, on shared lessons, has been trying to get timetables to match up and take into
Mhm.
account travel time between different campuses. But because we're able to do that remotely, then that was just a non-issue, which was great.
Mhm.
So we set up Attain. That's going really well. It's really popular. The demand is enormous. And we're working. What we're doing is we've got a kind of local group of independent schools called the West London Partnership, and we're using that to deliver this, because actually the demand, has exceeded even our capacity to staff. So Attain, is really important. But actually, in terms of the summer of catch up, I think, what we didn't want to do was to force people to sort of have to do lessons during the summer holiday, particularly given, the year they'd been through. And I think one of the other sort of things we learned about the pandemic is it kind of, uncovered things that have always been there, but we've not really paid
Yeah.
any attention to, which is things like holiday hunger. What do you do when schools are shut? If you're on free school meals, what happens when schools close? But actually, schools close all the time. It's called the holiday. And
Yes.
so,
Yes.
addressing holiday activities again, where we're kind of going with this now is we've got sort of, for want of a better word, term time interventions, which is the Attain program, but we've also now got holiday provision in terms of camps that give people access to outside space, which is a real premium. Healthy sport and physical exercise, which is also important for well-being, and crucially, of course, a decent breakfast and a decent lunch. So
Yeah.
those sort of that sort of holiday provision now means we've kind of got a kind of, wrap around all year provision. And I think the thing my kind of big learning from the pandemic was we'd been sort of, focusing on term time interventions and completely ignoring, well, what happens in the holiday? What is
Mm,
there for people? And so I think what we've got now is much more holistic. But the focus for us, particularly in that summer, and we talked to the Education Policy Institute about this and said, look, the government thinks people should be catching up on their English, maths, and science. Some schools are offering that. What would you recommend? And the strong steer from Natalie and her colleagues at the EPI was, actually focus on well-being, and they were so right. And
yeah,
so, we ran those summer camps. We had hundreds of children in who had been recommended by social services as people who would particularly benefit from that. And it was purely about getting outside, having fun, and really focusing on well-being, and that meant that they returned to school in September in a much better place than they would have been otherwise.
yeah.
So I think attain is very, very important, and we can demonstrate. I mean, in terms of our kind of early evaluations of the impact of that, it's having benefits not just in terms of measurable ones in terms of academic outcomes, but also in terms of confidence and motivation. So that's great. But I do think, alongside attain, that holiday provision is really important too.
What I love is coming through from what you're telling us here is a real sense of partnership, genuine partnership. You're listening to experts, to the other kind of partners that you work with who really know the communities in which you're working, and then you're reflecting and learning over time. But this isn't about sort of a top down, this is what we're offering because this is what we think you need. It's a much more collaborative process that you're using. And I know that some of what you've been doing is kind of initially a trial and then you expand it out. And so it's a much more iterative, collaborative process, it sounds like.
No, I think that's right. And the problem is, if it's just sort of one way, then effectively it's not partnership; it's
Yeah,
patronage,
absolutely.
and we're not really interested in that. And for example, our sixth formers who volunteer on a lot of our partnership programs, when they kind of reflect and evaluate what they've learned from the experience of doing it, they've got a lot out of it, and that's really important to me because this isn't about patronage or one-way traffic. This is about genuinely working together
Yeah.
and both sides benefiting from it. So that mutually beneficial aspect is really important. And when we're designing any kind of new partnership initiative, what we're always thinking about is, okay, how do we make this as mutually beneficial as possible?
Yeah, absolutely. And having it comes back to that authenticity that you mentioned earlier, doesn't it? And kind of treating these as partnerships of equals and listening and really actively listening and asking the right questions is far more important than determining yourself what others need. And then, as you say, it's not genuine partnership unless you're doing that. It sounds to me like you must be spending a fair amount of your leadership time on these areas. Have you found that to be a challenge in terms of the way the rest of the school is run? I mean, heads are notoriously busy with all of the other day-to-day things that are happening inside school. How do you balance all of these different challenges and kind of calls on your time?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very lucky. I mean, I'm blessed with an excellent senior management team, and also in our foundation office, both on the sort of the development and fundraising side, but also on the partnerships and outreach side. We've got a brilliant team of colleagues there. So, they do an incredible job. And I'm glad to give as much of my time as I can, to help them with that, and whether that's in the form of events, or meetings or advice, or whatever it might be. So I mean, it is something I make time for because it's important, and you'll know that IDPE have done some very good benchmarking on, in general,
Yes.
if as a head you spend more of your time on this, then your kind of return in terms of fundraising success is far larger.
Yeah.
But also, let's be honest, it can be some of the most rewarding stuff that you do in the space of a week. And you're right, heads have to do lots of things during the week. Some of them aren't very interesting, and some of them are really unpleasant and difficult. Whereas this stuff can be the stuff that keeps you going and gets you up in the
Mm.
morning. And so, in that sense, it's not a hardship devoting time to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we all need to find those little gems of the things that connect so wholly to our values that they keep us going through what can be quite a challenging working week sometimes. And I love as well that what you've just mentioned there. reflects back to the IDP benchmarking, not just in terms of the amount of time that a head should be dedicating to fundraising and to outreach and partnerships work, but also the fact that actually the benchmarking shows that the investment in the professional people to make this happen and to kind of be able to do this strategically, not to be constantly distracted by other things that are also being put their way that aren't necessarily around development. And so having a development team, or at least starting small with a development person, and making sure that you protect them from having too many other distractions so that they can really focus on this important work, whether it's specifically around fundraising or more widely around outreach and partnership as well.
I think that's right, and of course, where people sometimes go wrong is, when they're starting out, they appoint, whoever it might be, but then think that they can combine that role with other tasks that aren't
Yeah,
necessarily the same. For example, marketing or
yeah,
admissions or whatever it might be. And then also have unrealistic expectations about time horizons, and we know that it's going to take at least 3 years to start sort of to see things really coming to fruition, and we saw that. If I go back to 2004, our first year of fundraising, say £20,000,
yeah,
whereas 2017, which was I think the public launch of the campaign, it was about 9 million. So
yeah,
it's you've got to start small and somewhere, but also you've got to be realistic in your expectations of what a colleague can deliver, and make sure they've got the right support, and also that they've got the right access to you, the right access to governors, and the right profile within the common room. But then also know that you need to be realistic about the time horizon, about what you can expect, because otherwise, and we know this again, that's where it gets to 18 months, and then people part company because they haven't really thought it through.
yeah. And being strategic about all these things is so important. And generally, that means making choices, sometimes really hard choices, about what you're not going to do as well as what you are going to do. And therefore, being really focused in on making a really step change difference year on year, even though to begin with, as you say, those steps may be small, but they are focused, structured, and strategic in terms of building that culture. I think it's critically important that access to the to the head and the profile in the common room, I think, are really critically important, because without that, it can feel very isolating to be a fundraiser, the only fundraiser in a school, and to know that you've got the support of those around you and being able to ask for them for help in a really clear way. I need you to do this by this time. Do you think that would be possible? Rather than generally, I need you to help with fundraising, and not really being specific, is a way that small development teams can start to actually leverage the interest in what they're doing from across the school. Normally, the interest is there, it's the time that people have that they lack.
No, but again, this is where it is an advantage to have bursaries as pretty much your main fundraising
Yeah,
objective, because then if the foundation team are approaching anyone in the common room about anything, they tend to want to help, partly because they believe in what we're trying to do, and also they know that some of the loveliest kids in the school wouldn't be here if it
yeah,
weren't for the work of the foundation team, and so they can see the kind of the product, and they can understand that this isn't just about sort of money and numbers.
yeah.
This is about actually bringing real children into the school, and making the school a more open and realistic, grounded, interesting place.
Yeah, and that builds on that authentic commitment as well, doesn't it? It's not about numbers and finances. It's about the stories that we can tell as a result of the work that we're doing, which is fantastic. And just as David and I were reflecting there again on authenticity, a bit of a theme through our conversation, to give you the authentic reason, we then lost our internet connection, so we had to wrap up the interview at that point. Perhaps an authentic look at real life as we are in our internet age at the moment. So, to summarise my conversation with David, I think firstly, what really came through was that they are rooting their bursaries, their outreach, and their partnerships work in a way that all complements each other to address a single issue, which is reversing the attainment gap that has widened during COVID but has been there for decades and centuries before COVID as well. Rooting it back into the history of the school and its ethos, and having a real ambitious sense of what they can achieve as a school community, and being really focused about what they're trying to achieve It also struck me that they've really thought through the different messaging which needs to go to different audiences. So that sense of conveying to parents with pure passion that diverse classrooms are the best classrooms that children can be in, that there are real reasons why diversity matters as we educate all of our children, and therefore encouraging parents to see bursaries not just as a form of charity, but that as it is a form of lifting the whole school community and seeing the partnership that can be held with bursary pupils as well. The sense that they've got a slightly different narrative for their alumni around that kind of slightly grammar-focused tradition for the school. In fact, their students, their pupils are also raising money within their Raise Club. And then also a real clarity that this isn't just about pupils in the classroom on bursaries, it's also actually about staff recruitment and retention, and being really strategic about how all these things interplay with each other to strengthen the whole school from an ethos and culture point of view, and also from a business model point of view. So I think that what really struck me was this sense of a well-structured, well thought through bursaries outreach and partnership programme with authenticity really coming through in everything that they're doing. So thank you so much to David for giving his time to talk to us today on the Independent School Podcast. That's it for this week. Have a strategic week ahead of you, and I'll talk to you again next time. Bye-bye then. Thanks for listening to the Independent School Podcast, the podcast that helps senior leaders in private schools to think and act more strategically, both because they want to secure the future of their school and because they want to help build a more equal and just world. You can listen in everywhere that podcasts are available. And if you want to catch up on previous episodes or follow any of the links that I've mentioned today, just head over to www.consultjuliet.co.uk/podcast.